Hey, fifth graders. Welcome back to another excerpt of Nowhere Boy. When we left off yesterday, Ahmed almost got caught by Inspector Fontaine. He ran right into him. I think he looked at his face too, which makes me a little nervous. Ahmed was out trying to get pictures for his ID, and Max's job was to get a woman's voice, so he enlisted Farah and used her religion to do it. So let's see what happens today. As soon as the recess bell rang, Max waved Farah over to a corner of the fenced yard. Both Farah's friends and the Do You Speak English gang seemed to have accepted them as some sort of couple and left them alone. But Max still took a quick look around before he turned his back to them. Then he slipped the ID out of Boy Heroes and handed it to Farah. Guys, I love the name of that book that they're reading out of, Boy Heroes. That's intentional. I think Max and Ahmed both are heroes in this case. Max was proud of the work he and Ahmed had done. Claiming he needed supplies for a school project, Max had dragged Madame Pauline to the stationery shop, where he'd matched the color and stock of the ID paper. He had found the exact font online and laid out Ahmed's information in the same way. Ahmed's photo, the neatly trimmed hair, the hint of a smile, was exactly the image Max had hoped for. Together they had glued it to the ID, then Ahmed had pressed the commune stamp he had carefully carved into the hardened candle wax. A saint with a staff encircled by the words, Wolva Saint Labert. I'm 100% positive I'm saying that first word wrong. Max tried to read Farah's face to tell if she too was impressed, but she studied the ID without emotion. The accent is wrong, she finally said in French, pointing to the word nationalité. It should go the other way. So the little apostrophe over the word is going the wrong way. Madame Pauline was always scolding him for lazy copying. It had never seemed very important. Max, the details. Where have you heard the details are important before? Max figured that the teacher usually knew what he meant, but this was different. Thank you, he said gratefully. Farah turned the ID over, looking at it again. First the cover, then the inside with Ahmed's name, nationality, and a made-up national number. Finally, she stared at Ahmed's photo. He looks nice. He is nice, Max assured her. Farah reached out to hand the ID back to him. Except for the accent, it looks good. But Max barely had time to enjoy the compliment when a big hand yanked the ID out of hers. No, it doesn't. Oh my God. Max whipped around. Who would pull it out of his hand, fifth graders? Oscar stood behind them, peering at Ahmed's ID with a malicious grin. Max grabbed for it, but Oscar held it out of reach. Give that back, Farah demanded, but Oscar just rubbed one of his big fingers over the commune stamp. It's a fake. No, it's not, Max shot back, but no sooner had he said this than he remembered that Oscar's mom worked at the commune. Oscar rolled his eyes. Yes, it is, and I'm telling. Oh, no. Max couldn't believe his own stupidity. Oscar had been waiting for a chance to take his revenge. Max felt his hands ball into fists. I was wondering, I guess he had no choice to do it at school, but I did think that was very risky. Oscar turned to Farah. Who is this guy anyway? Max noticed her jaw tighten, but she didn't answer. Some terrorist friend of yours? This boy is not a terrorist, Farah hissed. He is a war refugee. He lost his entire family. He just wants to go to school like us. Max waited for the burst of laughter that would be his signal to pound Oscar as hard as he could, but Oscar didn't laugh. He lowered his arm and studied Ahmed's photo. Is this surprising you, fifth graders? This reaction is surprising me. His eyes narrowed like he didn't like what he saw, but at the same time, Max heard a small whoosh of breath, a little wistful sigh. It reminded Max of the way Oscar had stared at him after the lockdown. Could his mom be right? Please, Oscar, he said gently. Ahmed is nice. Oscar looked up from the ID and rolled his eyes. You say he's nice. But Max noticed he didn't walk away. If Oscar really wanted to tell, he would have. He had the evidence in his hand. He didn't need to argue about it. A crazy thought occurred to Max. What if they could convince Oscar to help? He had access to the commune through his mother, and he didn't seem to care about breaking rules. He might even be able to get them a real stamp. Well, this is a surprising turn, isn't it, fifth graders? This kid has been bullying him. Other sides to people that people surprise you? You want to meet him, Max asked. Max, Farah whispered, but he ignored her, keeping his gaze on Oscar. Oscar shook his head. I'm telling, but he sounded less certain than before. Max took a gamble. Maybe you're scared. Oscar took a menacing step toward him. I'm not scared. I'm just not an idiot like you. Then meet him, Max said calmly. Farah and me go with you, and if you think he's a bad person, you can tell on us. Oscar looked from him to Farah as if he was trying to figure out the trick. When, he finally said. Max pointed across the wall. Tomorrow, after school, in my backyard. Yikes. What do you think, fifth graders? Was he wrong to trust Oscar? Did he even have a choice? Chapter 31. Ahmed crouched behind the holly bush in the back of the garden waiting for Oscar. He was surprised by how determined he felt, especially since he had nearly changed his mind about the whole plan after running into Inspector Fontaine. The night after he'd bumped into the cop, he had been a restless one. What if Fontaine catches me? What if Farah betrays me? What if? The song of fear was a familiar one, and so too was its chorus. The world does not care about you. Oh, fifth graders, that is so, so sad. That is just heartbreaking imagery and language. I'm going to read that again. What if Fontaine catches me? These are his inner thoughts. What if Farah betrays me? What if? The song of fear was a familiar one, and so too was its chorus. The world does not care about you. We do, right, kids? Oh, that is to be that alone in the world. Oh, but Max did. And it was this thought that steeled his nerves as he waited in the chilly rain behind the holly bush. If Oscar told, he would have to say goodbye, not just to his cellar hideout, but to Max. So he's Max. You just need one person, right? At last he heard the back door open and voices speaking French. First a girl's, Farah's of course, then Max's, then a gruffer boy's voice he didn't recognize. This had to be Oscar's. Ahmed listened to the thuds of a football being kicked around. Madame Pauline was probably still watching from the picture window. But when the ball came sailing past him and rolled to a stop in front of the wall, Ahmed knew that the nanny had gone to the kitchen. This was the signal they had agreed on. As footsteps came his way, Ahmed straightened up, but he had been crouching for so long that when the large sandy-haired boy stepped in front of him, he was still hunched and stiff. The boy drew himself up as if to accentuate the difference, but he wouldn't look him in the eye. This is Ahmed, Max said. Ahmed stuck out his hand. Bonjour. Oscar lurched back. Ahmed realized he had frightened him and put down his hand. I speak a little English, Oscar said flatly. Ahmed smiled as politely as he could. Easier to me. But only Farah smiled back. Ahmed wondered whether to offer his hand too. It wasn't the Muslim custom between girls and boys, but Max had said she was a Belgian. It was Oscar who unknowingly saved him from this awkward situation by leaning right into his face. Which, I have to say, fifth graders, that is an aggressive act. If you lie, I know. Ahmed looked him in the eye. I not lie. I tell you only true. Oscar's pudgy face remained stony. Who are you and how did you get here? I am Ahmed Nasser, Ahmed began. I came from Syria to escape war. I come by sea to Greece. My family all dead. He paused there in part because the words caught in his throat, but also in the hope that Oscar would feel some pity. But the boy looked on with the same hostile expression. Why you come to Belgium? Man I go with has family here. Oscar crossed his brawny arms over his chest, then said something in French to Max. He said that this doesn't give you the right to be here too, Max said. I not know where to go, Ahmed admitted. But before he could explain further, Oscar interrupted, speaking in French to the others. What do you think, fifth graders? Does he have a right to be there? He is not Belgian, and his country's at war. What should he do? I mean, a country has to accept you or you have to sneak in. So, what do you think? I think that might be my question for today. Farah glowered. What? Ahmed said to Max. Max shifted uncomfortably. He's saying how the police are worried that terrorists could attack schools, and how does he know you're not trying to go to school to attack it? I know terrorists, Ahmed said. I hate these people, like you. But he could tell from Oscar's narrowed eyes that his words were unconvincing. He had to find a way to change the conversation, to reach Oscar before it was too late. My mother, sisters, grandfather, die in bomb. My father. Max leaned forward with interest. Remember, he's told about Max about his sisters and his grandfather and his mom, but he has not spoken of his papa. Ahmed knew he'd never told him the story, but he felt unable to, as if saying it out loud would confirm that his father's death was real. What happened to him? Asked Oscar. For the first time, Ahmed realized he sounded genuinely curious. But then he remembered something Max had told him. Oscar's father had died too. Oh, I forgot about that detail. Did you, fifth graders? He had to tell the story, and not just in a simple sentence or two, but with all the small, important details that would put Oscar on that deflating dinghy with him. From Turkey to Greece, we take boat. As best he could in a language that was not his own, he described the waves, the seawater rising around his feet, the woman's cries, the baby in the sling, not knowing how to swim, his father placing the inner tube around him, then jumping overboard to save them. The waves swept him away. The rain fell harder, but no one seemed to care. At Lesbos, Greek island, we pulled to shore. Ibrahim says I must come with him, that he promises my father this. I refuse. I stay for some days, sleep near beach. I hope for my father. Ibrahim is patient. He wait with me. He didn't even know him before that boat trip, fifth graders. He's another hero. Every night, the flimsy, overcrowded boats arrived, and rescuers on shore helped drag them in, pulling out screaming children, sobbing women, glassy-eyed men, and handing them blankets and bottled water. Ahmed always ran down to the beach to help in the hope his father might be there. But with each passing day, Ahmed knew there was less of a chance of ever finding his father, or even his body. One night there was a storm, and the next morning dawn brought a ghastly tide. A half-dozen drowned children. They lay on the rocky beach in contorted poses, still wearing their sneakers, clothes with the emblems of Western sports teams or cartoon characters, and the flimsy life jackets that had failed to save them. It was impossible to cry for them all. So Ahmed cried for none of them. Wow. Let me read that powerful language again, fifth graders. Whew. It was impossible to cry for them all, so Ahmed cried for none of them. Perhaps they were the lucky ones, freed from fear and pain from loss. When I stop to hope, I look at sea. I wish to join him. But you can't, Oscar said gruffly. Ahmed looked at him. It was the first time during the story he'd spoken. I know. I wonder if Oscar can relate to that feeling. Because his own father died. And so now they've found some common ground. And it's tragic, but you gotta stay in the game, guys. You gotta stay in the fight. You gotta hope, right? But that day on the beach, it was nearly August. The days were growing hotter, the sun searing his face as it reflected off the water. Despite Ahmed's grief, he was constantly hungry, with hundreds of new refugees arriving each day. The volunteers making sandwiches and handing out water were running out of supplies. I go with Ibrahim and his family to Kara Tepe camp. After some weeks, we are allowed on ferry to Athens. I go, but I feel nothing. I think nothing. Only about my father. You understand? For a moment, the others were silent, even Oscar. Your father was brave, Max said at last. Oscar kicked the wet ground and said something in French. Oscar, Farah said. While she unleashed a torrent of French, Ahmed turned to Max for an explanation. Max's cheeks colored slightly. He said your father was stupid for dying, for leaving you. Oh, that's so horrible. He tried to save him. Ugh, Oscar. Ahmed held up a hand and Farah stopped mid-tirade. He is right. Oscar looked him in the eye. Why you want school? Ahmed thought for a moment. There were so many ways to answer. Because his father had been a teacher. Because he wanted to learn. But one answer seemed truer than the others, and he had a feeling Oscar would understand it. I feel in the world alone. Oh, that is so sad. Sorry. I think this is my talent, fifth graders. I'm a crier during read alouds. That's my... Should I do that for the talent show? Just kidding. I'm going to read that again. But one answer seemed truer than the others, and he had a feeling that Oscar would understand it. I feel in the world alone. Oscar turned to Max, said something in French, and walked back to the house. Farah narrowed her eyes skeptically, but Max smiled. What'd he say? Ahmed asked. He told me to come to the commune with him after school tomorrow, Max said, and to bring along your passport and extra ID photos. Yay, Oscar. Okay. That's a lot, Oscar. You're pulling yourself out. You're pulling yourself out of this hole I put you in. That's amazing. But I'm still reeling from that. I feel in the world alone. Oh, we could write about that too, couldn't we, fifth graders? Maybe I'll leave that as an option. Chapter 32. The commune of Wolva-Saint-Lambert was a large yellow brick building with a distinctive clock tower. Max had been to it several times with his parents. As if they were ordering a sandwich, they had to take a little paper ticket printed with a number. Then they had to sit on hard plastic seats in the cavernous central hall, waiting for their number to flash on a large monitor. Sounds like the DMV, the Department of Motor Vehicles. Only then could they approach the clerks, who sat like bank tellers on the other side of a windowed wall, issuing documents with the stinginess of dentists giving candy. That is also great descriptive language, because we know dentists do not give out candy easily. The experience, however, was entirely different with Oscar by his side. Oscar didn't say much on the bus down Avenue Georges Henri. He seemed almost shy, and for a moment, Max worried that Farah was right, and he was planning to turn them in. The police station is near the commune, she'd pointed out. But as soon as they stepped off the bus, Oscar headed straight into the commune. He swept past the ticket machine, grunting a bonjour, madame, to the cranky old woman at the information desk, who replied, bonjour, Oscar. Oh, they know him there. In a tone actually approaching friendliness. He marched past the people in the plastic seats, clutching paperwork and anxiously watching the monitor. Then he rapped on a door in the center of the windowed wall marked no entry, employees only. So think about how different the experience is for refugees to Belgium versus someone like Oscar. Privilege. C'est moi, Oscar. It's me, he yelled. He hollered. A second later, the door opened and a bearded man whom Max recognized as one of the clerks greeted Oscar and waved them in. The door closed behind them with a click, and Max found himself on the other side of the windowed wall. The clerk's area was larger than it looked from the other side of the wall, with rows of computers and filing cabinets, and a lounge where the clerks could retreat for their endless lunch break. A woman's voice rang out from one of the windows reserved for native Belgians. Bonjour, petit chou! Max's lips twitched as he suppressed a laugh. He'd heard the French term of endearment before, but it was hard to imagine Oscar as little cabbage. That's what that translates to. The small, plump woman who rushed up to them fit the description far better herself. Bonjour, maman, Oscar replied, his cheeks reddening with what Max felt was the proper degree of embarrassment. And this is your friend, the American? The one you're always talking about from school and scouts, she said in French, turning to Max. Hello, Max. Hello, she said warmly in English. Bonjour, madame, Max said. Oscar had obviously prepared her for his arrival. But what surprised Max was the toujours, or always. Had Max been talking about him before this week? She seemed too enthusiastic for Oscar to have told her the true nature of their relationship. Oscar speak English, she said, beaming at Oscar. His father teach him. Me, not so well. Oscar scowled at her. You sound stupid. It's taught. That's so mean. Why would he humiliate his mother like that? Ugh! Oscar's mother blushed and gave a laugh. My kid did that to me, I would not laugh. See how smart he is, she said in French. Max nodded, but he felt sorry for both of them. Oscar's mother looked at a clock on the wall. I have a half hour left, but you two can sit in the lounge. Monsieur Dupont closed up, Oscar interrupted. Can't we play on his computer? Oscar's mother heaved a sigh that told Max that she'd prefer they didn't. You know I'm not really supposed to let... He doesn't care, Oscar said. He plays solitaire half the time on it himself. That's not true, his mother said. By this time, Oscar had already plopped in Monsieur Dupont's seat and turned on his monitor. She always lets me, whispered to Max in English. I've been playing on these computers for years. Take a chair. The battle lost, Oscar's mother retreated back to her window beside the bearded man. She pressed a buzzer, and Max could hear a ping outside as the next number appeared on the monitor. Seconds later, she was talking with someone on the other side of the window in French too rapid for Max to understand. You have photos and passport? Oscar whispered. Max pulled Boy Heroes out of his backpack and flashed it open to the page where he had stowed Ahmed's fake Syrian passport, the extra ID photos tucked inside it. Good, Oscar said. He had opened the solitaire window and rapidly played a few cards before switching windows. A screen came up asking for a password, and Oscar typed something. A second later, a list of names came up with dates of birth, addresses, and identity card numbers beside them. How do you know how to do that? Max whispered. Oscar shrugged. I hang out here a lot, so I watch and learn. He scrolled through the ends until he reached the name Nasser. It's good he has a popular surname. What is his mother's name? Max looked at the passport. Reem, R-E-E-M. Oscar moved his cursor down the list of Nassers. There is a Rima, R-I-M-A, close. Date of birth, 4 December 1992. Max was surprised by how swiftly he was able to do the calculation in his head. She's 24. Ahmed's 14. She cannot give birth to him at 10. Oscar quickly changed Rima to Reem, then 1992 to 1982. Then he pressed save. Anyone could make this errors, he said innocently. Yikes. Max couldn't help breaking into a grin. What? Oscar said. Nothing, Max said. It's just, you're a natural. Natural? Like, you're really good at this. Criminal mind, Oscar said, sounding pleased with himself. You know that term? Oscar's lips flickered as he fought a grin. I watch CSI Miami in English. You know this show? Then he highlighted and pasted the revised entry, hit copy, and switched screens to a file marked Identification Documents for Foreign Minors. He opened a new template, took out the ID that Max and Ahmed had forged, and copied the information. After he'd printed out the new ID, he glued on one of Ahmed's photos and wedged the document into what looked to Max like a large stapler and pulled down the handle. When he handed it back to Max, the commune seal was imprinted over Ahmed's photo. The ID looked as authentic as Max's. Oscar, enough computer, his mother called from the other side of the room in French. The clerk with the beard said something to Oscar's mom. Max couldn't make out the words, but he sensed from the way he cocked his head in their direction that he wasn't pleased they were still playing on it. Oscar ignored him. He deleted the template and opened another file marked Composition de Ménage. Aren't we done? Max said quietly in English. Oscar shook his head. You need this one too. What is it? Max said. The document that shows all the people in Ahmed's family home. The school asked for it. His parents must have turned this in without mentioning it to him. Max realized how much they needed Oscar, but he didn't know how to express this other than saying, thanks. Oscar smiled. We give him other family? Max nodded. Younger brothers and sisters. Excuses for his mother not to come to school. Names? Jasmine, Max said before he could stop himself. Nori, the baby. Oscar typed in the names and made up some birthdays. I like that they're using those names. It's good to speak the names of those you've loved and lost. Say their name. Say it with great love. But no father? No, Max agreed. Oscar printed this document out as well. Then he took out an ink pad and a rubber stamp. He had just stamped it with the official commune mark when the door opened. Bonjour tout le monde, said a familiar voice from behind them. Hello, everyone. Max shoved the document into his bag, then swung around. Inspector Fontaine was walking toward them. Mix, how weird, he said sternly in French. You should not be back here. Max's stomach dropped. Had Oscar tricked him? Perhaps he had just been pretending to help. He turned back to Oscar, who was playing solitaire and looking entirely calm and unbothered by the police officer's presence. I'm here with, Max started in French. Oscar and I go to school. We're friends, Oscar interrupted matter-of-factly. Was this true? Max prayed it was. He reminded himself that Inspector Fontaine worked with the commune. If his home visit was necessary for the approval of IDs and other documents, then he had a legitimate reason to be here. The friendship of boyhood, Inspector Fontaine said wistfully in English, leaning against a filing cabinet. I told you, Max, that I played in your garden with boys I am still friends with, though we are old men now. He chuckled, perhaps, at the idea of himself as old. Then his eyes fell on Oscar, and he took a step forward. Are you winning? Max suddenly noticed that he could see the tip of the composition de menage file still open at the top of the screen. There had been no time for Oscar to delete it. He had to distract Inspector Fontaine before he noticed. We still haven't found a gardener, he said. The police officer's brow crinkled as he looked toward Max. Oh, no? Tomek didn't work out? No, Max lied. My parents are going to find someone, though. Well, it is winter, Inspector Fontaine allowed, but you must tell them not to delay too long. When Max glanced back at the computer, the file edge had vanished. Max was ashamed of having doubted Oscar. He truly was a first-rate criminal mind. Is that a compliment? Oscar's mother closed her window and scurried over to Officer Fontaine. Hello, Emily. I told him not to use the computer. Hello, Emile. I think it's Emile. I told him not to use the computer, she said apologetically in French. Max waited for Fontaine to transform into the same ferocious cop he had seen on the street with the young Arab-looking man, but the police officer merely shook his head. Always breaking the rules, Oscar. You must listen to your mother. Sorry, Inspector, Oscar said, turning off the computer. Inspector Fontaine pulled a bundle of papers out of his messenger bag and handed them to Oscar's mother. For tomorrow, he said. Then he turned back to Oscar and Max. Play outside, boys. The world is much more interesting than a screen. Which, fifth graders, I bet you've heard a lot since we've been in lockdown, right? So what do you think? Oscar is breaking the rules. Certainly we think for a good cause, but is that okay? And let's contrast. Think about the difference between Inspector Fontaine, who's joking with the boys, being so nice, and how he was with that Arab-looking man on the street and how aggressive and rude he was with him. He's like completely different demeanor. Sounds racist to me. All right, we will pick up tomorrow. Make sure you comment and answer someone else's comment in the shared doc, okay? Bye, sweet kids.